Have you ever been told that what's killing you is completely harmless? That the very thing draining the life from your body, the thing making you unable to get out of bed, the thing stealing your future one agonizing day at a time, is nothing to worry about? I have. And let me tell you, when doctors, specialists, and everyone who's supposed to help you keeps repeating that same word over and over again like some kind of twisted mantra, harmless, 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 while you're literally dying in front of them, something inside you breaks. But then something else happens. Something they never expected. You become determined to make them see the harm they refuse to acknowledge, to document every single piece of evidence they ignored, to build a case so airtight, so undeniable, so meticulously detailed that they can never again look another patient in the eye and call their suffering harmless. This is the story of how I went from being dismissed as anxious, dramatic, and attention-seeking to forcing the entire medical establishment that failed me to confront the truth they tried so hard to bury. My name doesn't matter, but my story does, because I know I'm not alone. I know there are thousands, maybe millions of people out there right now being told that their pain isn't real, that their symptoms are in their head, that they just need to relax, exercise more, drink more water, reduce stress, as if any of those things could fix what was actually destroying me from the inside out. I was 28 years old when it started, living what most people would consider a pretty normal life, working as a graphic designer for a mid-sized marketing firm, dating someone I thought I might actually have a future with, saving up for a down payment on a small apartment, planning trips I'd never take, dreaming dreams that would soon become impossible. I remember the exact moment I first noticed something was wrong because it was so unremarkable, so easy to dismiss, which is exactly what I did at first. I was sitting at my desk, working on a redesign for a client's website, when I felt this strange sensation in my chest. Not pain exactly, but a fluttering, like a bird trapped inside my ribcage desperately trying to escape, its wings beating frantically against the bars of my bones. I put my hand over my heart and waited, feeling the irregular rhythm beneath my palm, fast, then slow, then fast again. No pattern, no predictability, just chaos wrapped in skin. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. I honestly couldn't tell you because time does strange things when your body starts betraying you, and then it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I took a deep breath, shook my head, and went back to work, convincing myself it was just stress, too much coffee, not enough sleep, all the usual suspects we blame when we don't want to face the terrifying possibility that something might actually be wrong. That was my first mistake, dismissing my own experience, gaslighting myself before anyone else even had the chance to, but I was good at it. I'd been trained my whole life to not make a fuss, to not be dramatic, to not inconvenience anyone with my problems, to suffer quietly and with a smile if I had to suffer at all. The fluttering came back the next day, and the day after that, and soon it was happening multiple times a day, sometimes lasting just seconds, sometimes stretching out for minutes that felt like hours, and with it came other symptoms. Fatigue that no amount of sleep could touch, brain fog that made me forget words mid-sentence, dizziness that made me grab onto walls and desks and door frames just to stay upright, and this overwhelming sense of dread that settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. I finally went to see my primary care doctor after 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks of telling myself it would get better, it would go away, it was nothing. Because that's what we do, isn't it? We wait and hope and minimize until we absolutely can't anymore. Dr. Patterson had been my physician for 5 years, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a perpetually rushed demeanor, always running behind schedule, always apologizing for the wait, always making me feel like I was taking up too much of her valuable time. I sat on the crinkly paper of the examination table and described my symptoms, trying to be precise, trying not to sound hysterical, measuring my words carefully because I'd learned that if you sound too worried, they think you're anxious, and if you don't sound worried enough, they think it's not serious and there's no perfect balance, no magic combination of words that will make them truly hear you. She listened while typing notes into her computer, nodding occasionally, her face a mask of professional concern that revealed nothing. When I finished, she asked me about my stress levels, my sleep habits, my caffeine intake, my exercise routine, all the questions I'd expected, all the questions that had nothing to do with the bird trapped in my chest or the fog consuming my brain. She examined me, pressing her stethoscope against my chest, listening to my heart, taking my blood pressure, looking in my ears and down my throat, performing the ritual of the physical examination with practiced efficiency. "Everything looks fine," she said finally, her tone bright and reassuring. I think you're experiencing anxiety. It's very common, especially in people your age with demanding jobs. I'm going to recommend you try some relaxation techniques, maybe yoga or meditation, and if it doesn't improve in a few weeks, we can discuss anxiety medication. I sat there stunned, trying to process what she'd just said, trying to find the words to make her understand that this wasn't anxiety, that I knew what anxiety felt like. I'd had anxiety before, and this was different. This was something physical, something wrong, something that needed investigation, not meditation. But she was already standing up, already moving toward the door, already dismissing me with a smile and a pamphlet about stress management. And I found myself nodding, thanking her, making another appointment for a month later, playing the role of the good patient who doesn't question, doesn't push back, doesn't make trouble. I left that office feeling smaller than when I'd entered, doubting myself, wondering if maybe she was right. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just stressed and anxious and making something out of nothing. And that voice, that terrible voice of self-doubt, is one of the most dangerous things about being dismissed by medical professionals, because it becomes part of you. It burrows into your brain and whispers lies that sound like truth. I tried the relaxation techniques, I really did, downloaded meditation apps and forced myself to sit still for 15 minutes every morning, breathing deeply, trying to quiet my mind, trying to convince my body that everything was fine. We're fine, nothing to worry about, just breathe, just relax, just let go of the fear. But the symptoms didn't improve, they got worse, spreading and multiplying like some kind of invasive species taking over the ecosystem of my body. The chest palpitations became more frequent, more intense, sometimes so severe that I had to stop whatever I was doing and focus entirely on breathing, on staying conscious, on not giving in to the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. The fatigue deepened until I was sleeping 10, 12, 14 hours a day and still waking up exhausted, dragging myself through life like I was moving through molasses, every action requiring monumental effort, every task feeling impossible. New symptoms appeared. Joint pain that made my knees and elbows ache like I was 80 instead of 28, headaches that pounded behind my eyes with relentless intensity, digestive issues that I won't describe in detail, but that made eating a complicated and often painful experience, and this strange sensitivity to temperature where I'd be freezing cold one moment and burning hot the next, my body unable to regulate itself, unable to maintain the basic equilibrium that healthy people take for granted. I went back to Dr. Patterson after 2 weeks instead of the recommended 4, unable to wait any longer, desperate for help, for answers, for someone to take me seriously. She seemed surprised to see me again so soon, a slight frown crossing her face as she pulled up my chart, and I could feel her skepticism before she even spoke. "The anxiety symptoms are still bothering you," she said, more statement than question, and I wanted to scream, wanted to shake her, wanted to make her understand that these weren't anxiety symptoms, that anxiety doesn't cause joint pain and temperature dysregulation and the complete collapse of your body's ability to function. But instead, I just nodded and said yes, but there's more now, and I listed the new symptoms, watching her face remain impassive, watching her type into her computer with that same neutral expression, watching her fail to connect the dots that seemed so obvious to me. She ordered some basic blood work, thyroid function, complete blood count, comprehensive metabolic panel, the standard tests that doctors order when they don't know what else to do but want to seem like they're doing something, and told me to follow up in a week to discuss the results. The test came back normal, everything within the reference ranges, nothing to indicate that anything was wrong, and Dr. Patterson called me personally to deliver the good news. Her voice cheerful and relieved. "See, I told you there was nothing to worry about. Everything looks great. Your body is perfectly healthy. This really does seem to be anxiety, and I'm going to write you a prescription for an SSRI that should help." I took the prescription, filled it at the pharmacy, stared at the pills in their little orange bottle, and felt a despair so deep it was almost physical, because part of me wanted her to be right, wanted this to be fixable with a simple medication, wanted there to be an easy answer. But another part of me, the part that knew my own body, that felt the wrongness deep in my bones, knew that this wasn't the solution, knew that we were missing something crucial, something dangerous. I took the medication anyway, because what else was I supposed to do? I'd been told by a medical professional that this was the answer, and we're trained to trust doctors, to believe that they know better than we do about our own bodies, to defer to their expertise even when every fiber of our being is screaming that something is wrong. The SSRI made me feel worse, not better, adding nausea and insomnia to my growing list of symptoms. making me feel disconnected from my body in a way that was both disturbing and oddly appropriate, since my body had already become a stranger to me, a malfunctioning vessel that I no longer recognized or trusted. I called Dr. Patterson's office after 2 weeks on the medication to report that it wasn't helping, that I was getting worse, and the nurse I spoke with, someone I'd never met, someone who'd never examined me, told me to give it more time, that SSRIs can take 4 to 6 weeks to reach full effectiveness, that the side effects would likely diminish, that I needed to be patient. Patient, I thought bitterly, hanging up the phone. I'm being nothing but patient. I've been patient for 2 months now while my life falls apart, while I lose the ability to work, to socialize, to do anything but survive from one day to the next. My boyfriend Marcus was trying to be supportive, but I could see the frustration and confusion in his eyes, the way he looked at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Someone he used to know who'd been replaced by this exhausted, anxious, constantly complaining stranger. He'd come home from work and find me on the couch where he'd left me that morning, still in my pajamas, surrounded by pillows and blankets, and he'd ask, gently at first, then with increasing exasperation, "Did you do anything today? Did you at least try to go for a walk? Maybe you'd feel better if you got some fresh air, some exercise? Maybe the doctor is right and you just need to push through it." I wanted to explain to him that there was no pushing through this, that this wasn't something I could overcome with willpower and positive thinking, that my body was actively failing me in ways I couldn't control, but the words wouldn't come. Or when they did come, they sounded weak and whiny even to my own ears. And I could see him pulling away, could feel the distance growing between us, could sense the approaching end of our relationship like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and destructive. Work became impossible. I'd taken so much sick time that my boss, Jennifer, called me into her office for a serious conversation about my performance and reliability. Her expression sympathetic but firm, her message clear without being explicitly stated, "We need someone we can count on, someone who shows up, someone who delivers, and right now you're not that person." I tried to explain, tried to make her understand that I was dealing with a medical issue, that I was trying to get help, that I wanted nothing more than to be the reliable employee I used to be. But I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me, or worse, that she thought I was exaggerating, making excuses, taking advantage of the company's generous sick leave policy. She suggested I take a leave of absence, get myself sorted out, and come back when I was ready to commit to my job. And though she framed it as a supportive gesture, I knew what it really was, a polite way of removing me from the equation until I could prove I was worth keeping around. I took the leave of absence because I had no choice, because I physically couldn't do my job anymore, couldn't sit at a desk for 8 hours, couldn't focus on design work, couldn't participate in meetings without feeling like I might pass out or throw up or simply cease to exist. My world was shrinking, collapsing in on itself, becoming smaller and smaller until it consisted of just my apartment, my couch, my bed, and the endless cycle of symptoms and sleep and desperate Googling of medical conditions that might explain what was happening to me. I became an expert in online medical research, spending hours every day reading about rare diseases, autoimmune conditions, cardiac abnormalities, neurological disorders, anything and everything that might fit my constellation of symptoms. And I'd find things, conditions that seemed to match, that explained the palpitations and the fatigue and the pain, and I'd screenshot articles and print out research papers and bring them to Dr. Patterson, certain that this time, she'd listen. This time she'd see what I was seeing. But every time she'd glance at my research with barely concealed annoyance, dismiss it with practiced efficiency. "That's very rare. You don't fit the diagnostic criteria. I really think you're overthinking this. You need to trust me, I'm the doctor." And I'd leave feeling foolish and frustrated and increasingly desperate. Have you ever felt completely alone in your own suffering, like you're screaming into a void and nobody can hear you? Comment below if you've ever been dismissed by a doctor when you knew something was seriously wrong. 3 months into this nightmare, 4 months, 5 months, I lost track of time because the days blurred together in a haze of symptoms and disappointment and growing terror. Marcus left me finally, unable or unwilling to deal with my illness anymore, and I couldn't even blame him because I wanted to leave me too, wanted to escape from this broken body, this failing system, this life that had become unrecognizable. I was alone, truly alone. No job, no partner, no energy to maintain friendships, nothing but my symptoms and my research and my stubborn, probably foolish refusal to accept that this was all in my head, that there was nothing physically wrong with me, that I was just anxious and needed to learn to cope better. So I started seeing other doctors, spending money I didn't have on specialist appointments, cardiologists and endocrinologists and rheumatologists, hoping that one of them would have the insight, the knowledge, the willingness to look deeper that Dr. Patterson lacked. The cardiologist did an EKG and an echocardiogram and told me my heart was structurally normal. The palpitations were benign, nothing to worry about, probably anxiety-related. Have you considered seeing a therapist? The endocrinologist ran more blood tests, more thyroid panels, cortisol levels, hormone assessments, everything within normal ranges. Nothing to explain my symptoms, probably anxiety. Have you tried cognitive behavioral therapy? The rheumatologist examined my joints, ordered inflammation markers, autoimmune panels, all negative. No signs of arthritis or lupus or any other rheumatological condition. Your pain is likely tension-related, possibly fibromyalgia, which is often associated with anxiety and depression. Have you considered antidepressants? Every single one of them said the same thing in different words: harmless, benign, anxiety, stress, psychological, and with each dismissal, each reassurance that nothing was wrong, I felt myself fragmenting, losing my grip on reality, questioning my own sanity, because when every single medical professional you see tells you that what you're experiencing isn't real, isn't physical, isn't dangerous, you start to believe them. You start to internalize the message that you're broken in a different way, that the problem isn't your body, but your mind, your perception, your inability to cope with normal life stress. But my body kept getting worse, kept deteriorating in ways that couldn't be explained by anxiety alone. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the doubt and fear and exhaustion, I knew with absolute certainty that something was terribly, dangerously wrong. I was losing weight rapidly, not because I was trying to, but because eating made me feel sick, because food tasted wrong, because my digestive system seemed to have forgotten how to process nutrients properly. My hair was falling out in clumps, clogging the shower drain, coating my pillowcase, leaving visible bald patches on my scalp that I tried to hide with strategic styling and hats. My skin developed a strange pallor, a grayish tone that made me look like I was already dead, already gone, just a ghost going through the motions of being alive. I had bruises that appeared without cause, dark purple marks on my arms and legs that I couldn't remember getting, that seemed to bloom spontaneously like terrible flowers on the landscape of my skin. My hands shook constantly, tremors that made simple tasks like drinking from a glass or typing on my phone exercises in concentration and frustration. I was cold all the time, wearing sweaters and wrapped in blankets even in the summer heat, my body unable to generate or maintain warmth, my fingers and toes perpetually icy, bloodless, numb, and through it all, the chest palpitations continued, grew more severe, more frequent, sometimes so intense that I could see my shirt moving with each irregular beat, could feel my entire body shaking with the force of my heart's chaotic rhythm. I started having episodes where my heart would race so fast I couldn't count the beats, where it felt like it might actually explode from the effort, where I'd become lightheaded and breathless and terrified, absolutely convinced that this was it. This was the moment I was going to die. Alone in my apartment with nobody to help me, nobody to call an ambulance, nobody to care. But I didn't die. Not then. The episodes would eventually subside. My heart would slow down, return to something resembling normal, and I'd be left shaking and sweating and wondering how much more of this I could take, how many more times I could survive these attacks before my luck ran out. 7 months after the symptoms began, 7 months of being told everything was harmless, 7 months of deterioration and dismissal and desperation, I finally had the episode that changed everything, the one that nearly killed me, the one that I think about every single day, the one that proved, beyond any shadow of doubt, that what I'd been experiencing was not harmless, was not anxiety, was not in my head, but was real and dangerous and life-threatening. It was a Tuesday afternoon, I remember, because Tuesdays had always been my favorite day of the week. Something about being past Monday but not yet midweek. A day of possibility and momentum. Though by this point in my illness, the days had lost their individual characters, had become interchangeable units of suffering. I was sitting on my couch trying to watch a movie, something light and distracting, when the palpitations started again. But this time they were different, more intense, more irregular, more terrifying than they'd ever been before. My heart wasn't just fluttering or racing, it was doing something else entirely, something that felt wrong in a fundamental, catastrophic way, like an engine misfiring, like a machine breaking down, like the central pump of my circulatory system forgetting how to do its job. I put my hand on my chest and felt chaos. No rhythm at all, just random beats, fast, then slow, then fast, then nothing. Then a series of rapid beats, then nothing. And with each nothing, each pause where my heart should have beat but didn't, I felt consciousness slipping away, felt the world going dark at the edges, felt myself falling into a void I might not come back from. I tried to stand up, thinking I needed to call for help, needed to get to my phone, needed to do something, but my legs wouldn't support me, wouldn't hold my weight, and I collapsed onto the floor, my body refusing to obey my commands, my muscles weak and unresponsive. The last thing I remember clearly is lying on the carpet, staring at the ceiling, feeling my heart doing its terrible, irregular dance inside my chest, wondering if anyone would find me, if anyone would care, if this was how my story ended, dismissed and doubted and dead at 28, from something everyone had insisted was harmless. Then everything went black, a complete absence of consciousness, of thought, of sensation, just nothing, the void I'd feared, the end I'd worried about, death or something so close to it that I couldn't tell the difference. I woke up in the hospital, though I don't know how I got there. Don't remember the ambulance or the emergency room or anything between losing consciousness on my apartment floor and opening my eyes to fluorescent lights and the beeping of medical equipment. Later, I'd learned that my neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who I'd barely spoken to in the 2 years I'd lived in that building, had heard a loud thump when I fell, and when I didn't answer her knocking, had called the building manager who'd used his master key to check on me. They'd found me unconscious, barely breathing, my lips blue, my skin cold, my pulse weak and irregular, and they'd called 911, probably saving my life with that call, though I wouldn't fully appreciate that fact until much later, until I understood just how close I'd come to dying. The emergency room doctors ran tests, lots of tests, more than any of the specialists I'd seen, more than Dr. Patterson had ever ordered, and what they found shocked them, shocked me, shocked everyone who'd been so confident that nothing was wrong, that everything was anxiety, that my symptoms were harmless. My potassium levels were critically low, dangerously depleted, at a level that should have killed me, that explained the cardiac arrhythmias, the muscle weakness, the entire cascade of symptoms I'd been experiencing for 7 months. But that wasn't all. There was more. Because the low potassium wasn't random, wasn't just a dietary deficiency, it was being caused by something else. Something the emergency room doctors recognized immediately as serious and requiring urgent investigation. They admitted me to the hospital, started IV potassium replacement, hooked me up to a cardiac monitor, and scheduled me for more tests, imaging studies and endocrine workups and consultations with specialists who, unlike the ones I'd seen before, actually seemed concerned, actually took my symptoms seriously, actually believed me when I said I'd been feeling terrible for months. Over the next 3 days, while I lay in that hospital bed watching my heart rhythm on the monitor, watching the irregular beats slowly become more regular as my potassium levels normalized, the doctors put together the pieces of the puzzle that should have been solved months earlier. I had a rare endocrine tumor, a growth on my adrenal gland that was secreting excessive amounts of aldosterone, a hormone that causes the kidneys to waste potassium while retaining sodium, leading to the severe electrolyte imbalance that had been destroying my body, disrupting my heart rhythm, causing all the symptoms that everyone had dismissed as anxiety. The condition is called primary hyperaldosteronism, or Conn's syndrome, and it's rare but not that rare, affecting about 1 in every 100 people with high blood pressure, except I didn't have high blood pressure, which is why nobody had thought to test for it, why it had been missed by every doctor I'd seen, why I'd come so close to dying from something that's actually very treatable when diagnosed. The endocrinologist who came to see me in the hospital, Dr. Ramirez, a tall woman with gray-streaked hair and eyes that actually met mine when she spoke, actually looked at me like I was a person rather than a problem to be solved or dismissed, sat down beside my bed and said something I'll never forget. "I'm so sorry you weren't diagnosed sooner. I'm sorry you had to go through all of this. What you experienced was not anxiety. It was a real, physical, dangerous condition. And you were right, to keep pushing for answers, to keep insisting that something was wrong." I started crying when she said that. Not gentle tears, but huge, racking sobs that shook my entire body. Because those words, that validation, that acknowledgement that I hadn't been crazy or dramatic or anxious, that my suffering had been real, meant more to me than I can possibly express. She held my hand while I cried, didn't rush me, didn't try to make me stop, just sat there with me in my grief and relief and rage, bearing witness to the emotional release of 7 months of being gaslit and dismissed and doubted. We talked for a long time that day. about my symptoms, about how long I'd been experiencing them, about all the doctors I'd seen, all the tests that had been run, all the reassurances I'd been given that everything was harmless. And with each detail I shared, I could see the anger growing in her eyes, the recognition of a massive medical failure, a system that had failed me spectacularly, repeatedly, almost fatally. She explained that primary hyperaldosteronism can be difficult to diagnose, that it requires specific tests that aren't part of routine blood work, that many doctors aren't familiar with it and don't think to test for it. But she also said, and this is what stuck with me and ultimately drove everything that came after, that many of my symptoms should have prompted further investigation, that the severe hypokalemia, the low potassium that nearly killed me, should have shown up on the basic metabolic panel that Dr. Patterson had ordered early on. And when I asked why it hadn't, why those results had come back normal, she asked to see my records, the actual lab results, and when I pulled them up on my phone, when she looked at the numbers, her expression changed, darkened, became something between shock and fury. Your potassium wasn't normal, she said quietly. It was low normal, at the very bottom of the reference range, and given your symptoms, given what you were describing to your doctor, this should have been investigated further. At minimum, the test should have been repeated, you should have been monitored, but instead you were told everything was fine and sent home with a prescription for anxiety medication. That's when something crystallized inside me, something hard and sharp and absolutely determined, a resolve that would shape the next phase of my life, a decision that I made in that hospital bed with my heart rhythm finally steady, my potassium levels slowly climbing back toward normal, my body beginning the long process of healing from months of illness and neglect. I was going to document everything, every instance of dismissal, every test result that had been misinterpreted or ignored, every symptom that had been attributed to anxiety, every appointment where I'd been made to feel crazy or dramatic or attention-seeking, and I was going to use that documentation to make sure this never happened to anyone else, to hold accountable the medical professionals who had failed me so catastrophically, to make the harm, the very real harm that they'd insisted, was harmless, impossible to ignore or deny. I stayed in the hospital for a week while they stabilized my electrolytes, scheduled surgery to remove the tumor, started me on medications to manage my blood pressure and aldosterone levels in the meantime. And during that week, I began my mission, requesting copies of all my medical records from every doctor I'd seen, every specialist who'd dismissed me, every emergency room visit, every lab result, every clinical note where a healthcare provider had documented their assessment of my condition. The records arrived in thick manila envelopes and electronic files, hundreds of pages of medical jargon and test results and physician notes. And I read through every single page, highlighting, annotating, cross-referencing, building a timeline of my illness and the medical response to it, or rather the lack of response, the systematic failure to investigate, to follow up, to take seriously the suffering of a young woman who didn't fit neatly into their diagnostic boxes. What I found in those records was enraging, infuriating, devastating in its casual cruelty and careless dismissiveness. Dr. Patterson's notes from my first visit described me as an anxious young woman with vague somatic complaints, recommended reassurance, and stress management. No further testing indicated. My second visit, when I'd returned because the symptoms were getting worse, was documented as patient continues to focus on physical symptoms despite normal exam and labs, likely health anxiety. Started on SSRI. The visit where I'd brought printed research about conditions that might explain my symptoms was noted as patient presenting with internet research, reassured about benign nature of palpitations, encouraged to limit online searching which may be contributing to anxiety. Every single note, every single encounter, painted me as the problem, as someone who was anxious and fixated and unwilling to accept reassurance, rather than as someone who was actually sick, actually in danger, actually in desperate need of proper medical investigation. The specialist notes were no better. The cardiologist had written essentially normal cardiac function, palpitations likely benign, patient appears anxious about symptoms. The endocrinologist had documented patient very concerned about thyroid. Despite normal labs, discussed psychosomatic component of symptoms. The rheumatologist had noted patient focused on finding organic cause for pain. No objective findings on exam. Suspect centralized pain syndrome possibly related to anxiety or depression. Not one of them, not a single doctor, had documented my symptoms accurately, had taken my history seriously, had considered that my persistent concerns might indicate something real rather than something psychological. And there, in the emergency department records from the day I'd nearly died, was the most damning evidence of all. A note from the ER physician who'd initially seen me, before the lab results came back, before anyone knew how sick I really was, that read patient known to have health anxiety per PCP records, however given syncope and palpitations will run basic labs and cardiac workup. Even in the emergency room, even when I was unconscious and barely alive, my history of being dismissed, of being labeled anxious, had preceded me, had influenced how I was perceived, had nearly prevented the thorough investigation that saved my life. I photocopied everything, scanned every page, created both physical and digital archives of my medical records, my research, my documentation of symptoms I'd tracked in journals and apps, and then I started writing, crafting a detailed account of my experience, a narrative that told the story of a medical system that had failed me, that had prioritized their assumptions over my reality, their convenience over my health, their egos over my life. I wrote about the specific missed opportunities, the low normal potassium that should have prompted repeat testing, the progressive weight loss and hair loss that should have triggered concern, the severe cardiac symptoms that should have been investigated beyond a simple EKG, the constellation of symptoms that, taken together, should have pointed away from anxiety and towards something metabolic or endocrine. I wrote about the emotional toll of being dismissed, the way it had made me doubt myself, question my sanity, internalize shame and guilt for symptoms I couldn't control, the way it had cost me my job, my relationship, my quality of life, nearly my life itself. I had the surgery 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, a laparoscopic adrenalectomy to remove the tumor that had been poisoning my body for who knows how long. Months, certainly, maybe years. Slowly growing and secreting its excess hormones and depleting my potassium until I'd reached the crisis point that had finally gotten me proper medical attention. The surgery went well, the tumor was benign, and within days of its removal, I started feeling better. Really better. Not the fake better I'd tried to convince myself of when taking anxiety medication, but actual, physical, measurable improvement. My energy returned gradually but steadily, the brain fog lifted, the palpitations stopped almost entirely, the dizziness and weakness faded, the joint pain diminished, my hair stopped falling out, my skin regained its normal color, my body remembered how to regulate its temperature, how to digest food, how to exist in the world without constant suffering. It was miraculous and it was enraging, because it proved, undeniably, that everything I'd been experiencing had been real, had been physical, had been caused by this tumor, by this condition, by something that could have been diagnosed months earlier if anyone had bothered to look, to test, to take me seriously. Dr. Ramirez became my advocate, writing a detailed letter about my case, about the diagnostic delays and their consequences, documenting the near-fatal outcome of a condition that should have been caught much earlier, and she encouraged me to file formal complaints, to report what had happened, to make sure the medical professionals involved understood the gravity of their failures. But I wanted to do more than just file complaints that would probably be dismissed or ignored or buried in bureaucratic processes. I wanted to create something undeniable, something that would force everyone who'd called my condition harmless to confront the actual harm they'd caused, to see it laid out in black and white, backed by evidence, supported by medical records, impossible to rationalize or explain away. I spent 2 months creating what I came to think of as the document, a comprehensive, meticulously researched, extensively documented analysis of my medical case, combining my personal narrative with medical evidence, research papers about primary hyperaldosteronism, documentation of missed diagnostic opportunities, expert opinions I'd solicited from other endocrinologists about what should have been done differently, and a point-by-point breakdown of every instance where healthcare providers had failed to meet the standard of care. It was 57 pages long, single-spaced, with 23 pages of appendices, including medical records, lab results, research citations, and supporting documentation. I formatted it professionally, like a legal brief or medical case report, with a table of contents, section headers, footnotes, and a summary of findings that read like an indictment, which, in a way, it was, an indictment of a system that had nearly killed me through its negligence, its bias, its stubborn refusal to look beyond the easy diagnosis of anxiety. I printed multiple copies on high-quality paper, bound them professionally, and then I started delivering them personally to every single person who'd told me I was fine, who'd dismissed my symptoms, who'd called my suffering harmless. I started with Dr. Patterson walking into her office without an appointment, asking the receptionist if I could please speak with the doctor for just a few minutes. I had something important to give her. The receptionist, probably sensing something in my demeanor, in the way I was clutching this thick, bound document, went to check, and surprisingly, Dr. Patterson agreed to see me. Probably out of curiosity, maybe out of some lingering sense of professional responsibility. I walked into her office, that same office where I'd sat so many times feeling dismissed and doubted, and I placed the document on her desk, my hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, despite the anxiety, real anxiety this time, about this confrontation I'd been planning for months. I told her, my voice calm and clear and utterly cold, that I wanted her to read this, to understand what had actually been wrong with me, to see the harm that her dismissiveness had caused, to recognize that when she'd told me everything was harmless and sent me home with anxiety medication, I'd actually been dying of a treatable condition that she'd failed to diagnose. I watched her face as I spoke, watched the color drain from it, watched the professional mask slip to reveal something like fear, or maybe guilt, or maybe just discomfort at being confronted by a patient who refused to go away quietly, who refused to accept the narrative that she'd done nothing wrong. She opened her mouth to speak, probably to defend herself, to explain, to rationalize, but I held up my hand and said, I don't want to hear your excuses, I don't want your apologies, I just want you to read this. All of it, every page, every word. And I want you to think about the next patient who comes to you with symptoms you don't immediately understand. The next young woman who insists something is wrong, and I want you to remember me. Remember what happened when you decided her concerns weren't worth investigating. Then I walked out, not waiting for a response, not interested in whatever she might say, feeling a sense of power and purpose that I hadn't felt in over a year, feeling like I was finally being heard, even if she never actually read what I'd written, even if it went straight into her trash can the moment I left. I had said my piece, had made my statement, had refused to be silent about what had happened to me. I did the same with every specialist, every doctor who'd seen me and sent me away with reassurances that everything was fine, appearing at their offices, requesting brief meetings, delivering my document with the same calm, controlled statement about the harm their harmless diagnosis had caused. Some refused to see me, had their staff turn me away, but I left the documents anyway, with cover letters explaining what was inside, what had happened to me, what their dismissal had nearly cost me. Some did meet with me, and their reactions varied, some defensive, some apologetic, some genuinely shocked to learn how sick I'd actually been, how close I'd come to dying, but all of them uncomfortable, all of them forced to confront their failure, to see it documented in excruciating detail, to recognize that their casual dismissiveness had nearly killed someone. I filed formal complaints with the state medical board about Dr. Patterson specifically, submitting the document as evidence, detailing the ways she'd failed to meet the standard of care, failed to follow up on abnormal findings, failed to investigate symptoms that warranted further testing, failed to take seriously a patient's persistent and worsening complaints. I didn't know if anything would come of it. Medical board complaints are notoriously difficult to win. Doctors protect other doctors. The system is designed to give physicians the benefit of the doubt. But I had to try, had to at least make the attempt to hold her accountable, to create a record of what had happened, to potentially prevent her from doing the same thing to someone else. I also shared my story more broadly, writing an article about my experience that was published in a patient advocacy magazine, speaking at a conference about diagnostic errors and medical gaslighting, connecting with support groups for people with rare diseases and people who'd been dismissed by the medical establishment, finding a community of people who understood, who'd been through similar experiences, who validated my anger and my pain and my determination to make things better. What I found in these communities was both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because I wasn't alone, because there were thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who'd been told their symptoms were anxiety when they were actually autoimmune disease, or cancer, or cardiac conditions, or neurological disorders, or any of a million other real, physical, dangerous illnesses, and horrifying because the problem was so much bigger than just my experience, so systemic and pervasive and deeply embedded in medical culture that I didn't know how to fix it, didn't know if it could be fixed, didn't know if anything I did would actually make a difference. But I kept going anyway, kept speaking up, kept sharing my story, kept delivering my documents, kept refusing to let this be forgotten or minimized or dismissed the way my symptoms had been dismissed. The medical board investigation took 8 months. 8 long months during which I didn't know what was happening, didn't know if they were taking it seriously or just going through the motions, didn't know if anything would come of my complaint. Then I got a letter, official and formal, informing me that they'd completed their investigation and found that Dr. Patterson had failed to meet the standard of care in several specific ways, that she'd been formally reprimanded, required to complete additional training in diagnostic reasoning and patient communication, and placed on a monitoring period during which her patient care would be reviewed regularly. It wasn't a suspension, wasn't a revocation of her license, wasn't the dramatic punishment that part of me had wanted, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was accountability. It was proof that what had happened to me mattered, that medical professionals couldn't just dismiss patients without consequences, that harm, even harm they'd insisted was harmless, could have repercussions. I cried when I got that letter, not sad tears, but something more complicated, a mixture of vindication and grief, relief and rage, satisfaction and sorrow for all the months I'd lost, all the suffering I'd endured, all the damage that had been done and could never be fully undone. I was better now. Physically recovered from the surgery, my potassium levels stable, my symptoms resolved, my body functioning normally again. But I was also changed, fundamentally altered by this experience, by the trauma of being dismissed, by the near-death experience that could have been prevented, by the understanding of how fragile we all are, how dependent on a medical system that doesn't always deserve our trust, how easily we can slip through the cracks when we don't fit neatly into expected patterns. Looking back now, 3 years later, I can see how this experience shaped me, how it turned me into an advocate, a voice for people who aren't being heard, a person who refuses to stay silent when I see others being dismissed the way I was dismissed. I volunteer with patient advocacy organizations. I speak at medical schools about the importance of listening to patients, of taking seriously their lived experiences, of investigating thoroughly before attributing symptoms to anxiety or stress. I've connected with other people who've had similar experiences, who've nearly died or actually lost loved ones to conditions that were dismissed as harmless, and together we're trying to change the culture of medicine, to make it safer, more responsive, more willing to acknowledge uncertainty rather than defaulting to dismissiveness. It's slow work, frustrating work, work that often feels futile when I hear yet another story of someone being told their cancer symptoms are anxiety, their heart attack is a panic attack, their autoimmune disease is just stress, but I keep doing it because I have to, because I survived when I could have died. And I feel like I owe it to all the people who didn't survive, who weren't lucky enough to have a Mrs. Chen who heard them fall, who weren't lucky enough to get to the emergency room in time, who died alone with everyone around them convinced their symptoms were harmless. This is my purpose now, making sure that harm is never called harmless, that suffering is never dismissed, that patients are believed and investigated and treated with the dignity and seriousness they deserve. I made my harm very clear on paper, in 57 pages of undeniable evidence, and I'll keep making it clear in every story I share, every speech I give, every patient I connect with who needs someone to tell them that they're not crazy, that they're not dramatic, that they deserve to be heard and helped and healed. So if you're watching this and you've ever been dismissed by a doctor, if you've ever been told your symptoms are anxiety when you know in your bones that something else is wrong, if you've ever felt like you're going crazy because everyone is telling you you're fine when you're absolutely not fine, I want you to know that you're not alone, that your experience is valid, that you have every right to keep pushing for answers, to demand further testing, to seek second opinions and third opinions, and as many opinions as it takes to find someone who will actually listen. Don't let anyone make you doubt your own body, your own experience, your own instincts about your health. You are the world's foremost expert on what it feels like to be you. And if something feels wrong, it deserves investigation, not dismissal. I want you to comment below about your experiences. Have you ever been dismissed by medical professionals? What happened? How did you advocate for yourself? Let's create a community of people who support each other, who validate each other's experiences, who refuse to let harm be called harmless. If this story resonated with you, if it touched your heart or made you angry or gave you hope, please hit that like button. It helps more people find this video, more people who need to hear this message, more people who need to know they're not alone in their struggle to be heard. Subscribe to Living Through It for more stories like this, real experiences from real people about surviving, advocating, and finding strength in the face of medical dismissal and systemic failure. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new video, because every story matters. Every experience deserves to be shared, and together we can create change, can make the medical system better, can ensure that fewer people have to go through what I went through, what so many of us have gone through. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community of survivors and advocates and people who refuse to be silenced. Your voice matters, your story matters, your health matters, and don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise.